Blenheim Close was the kind of street that felt, well, frozen in time. Tidy hedges, quiet neighbours, and, the occasional chatter of birds on a slow afternoon. In a small English town like Mansfield, not much ever changed. And honestly, that's just how the residents liked it. At number 6 lived William and Patricia Wycherley, an elderly couple, private, a little old-fashioned, maybe even a bit reclusive, but always polite. They paid their bills, kept to themselves, and were rarely seen. In a place where gossip traveled faster than the mail, their quietness just became part of the background noise. Then came the spring of 1998. No one had seen the Wycherleys in weeks. When a neighbour finally asked about them, their daughter Susan explained it casually, saying, "They've gone away, moved to the coast. They wanted a simpler life." A few months later, the couple sent a postcard, sun, sand, and warm greetings. Over the years, the letters kept coming. Birthdays, Christmas, holidays. They were fine, just living their lives. That's what everyone believed. Until someone started asking questions, the kind that just don't go away. Why were pension checks still being cashed? Why had no one actually seen the Wycherleys in over a decade? And who exactly were the couple now connected to their home? The answers would begin with a single name, Susan Edwards. Meet Susan and Christopher Edwards. Susan Edwards was William and Patricia Wycherley's only child. Polite, a bit withdrawn, and intensely private. She rarely called attention to herself, unless it had something to do with Hollywood. From the outside, Susan and her husband Christopher seemed like an unremarkable pair. They lived quietly in a small flat in Dagenham, a working-class suburb east of London. No criminal records, no public outbursts, just ordinary. But behind the curtains, their life told a very different story. Susan was obsessed with old Hollywood, not just the movies, but the golden era stars. She idolized them, studied them, even spoke about them like they were still alive. Christopher, gentle and loyal, shared in her obsession. Together, they built a fantasy world filled with vintage posters, collectible autographs, and dreams of a glamorous life far from their grey surroundings. And like many fantasies, it came at a steep price. The memorabilia didn't come cheap, but they kept buying rare items, one-of-a-kind signatures, old photos. They believed it was a legacy they were building, an escape. But as their spending spiraled out of control, reality closed in. Then in May 1998, just as they were sinking deeper into debt, Susan's parents decided to pay them a visit. No one knew it then, but that visit would mark the beginning of a long and deadly deception, one that would bury the truth quite literally for the next 15 years. To understand why Susan and Christopher Edwards did what they did, you need to understand what they were chasing. They weren't after money in the traditional sense. They weren't trying to buy luxury cars or move into a mansion. Their dream was simpler and, well, stranger. They wanted to live among legends. The Edwardses were addicted to old Hollywood. Not just the films, but the stars themselves. Susan especially had an emotional attachment to the golden age of cinema. She spoke about Gary Cooper like he was a close friend. She believed she had a connection to these celebrities, as if their fame somehow validated her own life. Together, she and Christopher built a private shrine in their home. The walls were lined with rare posters, signed photographs, even handwritten notes from famous actors, some of which cost thousands of pounds. They weren't casual collectors. They were obsessed. They would spend money they didn't have just to own a piece of a world long gone. But the problem was, they were broke. They borrowed money, maxed out credit cards, and racked up debts they had no way to repay. When they ran out of options, desperation crept in, and then Susan had an idea. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they did own their home outright. They received monthly pensions. There was also some savings in the bank. If those could somehow fall into her hands, maybe, just maybe, she and Christopher could keep their dream alive. It's not clear exactly when the idea turned into a plan, but by May 1998 it was already in motion. And when Patricia and William Wycherley showed up for a quiet weekend visit, they unknowingly stepped into a trap that had been years in the making. It was the May Day bank holiday weekend in 1998 when William and Patricia Wycherley visited their daughter and son-in-law at their modest home in Dagenham. What was said behind those walls has never been fully revealed. There were no witnesses, no screaming, no commotion, just silence. What we do know is this. By the end of that weekend, William and Patricia were dead, both shot and killed in cold blood. According to Susan, the killing began with an argument. She later claimed her mother provoked her, that they fought bitterly, and that Patricia pulled out a gun first. But investigators, and eventually the court, found no signs that this was an act of self-defense. Quite the opposite, actually. The story that emerged was calculated and chilling. Susan shot her father first while he sat drinking tea in the back garden. Then when her mother came looking for him, she turned the gun on her too. 2 bullets, 2 lives gone, just like that. She didn't panic. She called Christopher, who was out of town at the time, and together they made a plan. When he returned, they wrapped the bodies and buried them side by side in the garden of the Wycherleys' Mansfield home. They covered the shallow graves with soil and fresh flowers, a symbolic burial under a bed of blooming lies. Then they went shopping. In the days that followed, Susan and Christopher emptied the Wycherleys' bank accounts. They forged signatures. They redirected pension checks. For the next 15 years, they created an elaborate fiction, sending letters to family members, pretending the Wycherleys were still alive, and using the stolen money to buy more memorabilia. The murders weren't crimes of passion. They were strategic, quiet, void of remorse. 2 people eliminated, not for revenge, not for rage, but for money. The garden became their grave. And the Edwardses? They became actors in their own twisted drama, starring as the perfect couple, hiding a secret that lay 6 feet beneath the soil. You'd think hiding 2 murders would be impossible. But Susan and Christopher Edwards were meticulous. They didn't just cover up the crime, they rewrote reality. After burying the bodies in the garden, they took over the Wycherleys' financial lives. They forged signatures to keep pension checks flowing. They filed fake letters with the Department for Work and Pensions. They even submitted tax returns in the Wycherleys' names. For 15 years, no one questioned it. When family members asked about William and Patricia, Susan had answers. She told relatives they'd moved to Ireland. Later it was the coast. Sometimes she said they were traveling abroad. She even sent Christmas cards from her parents, forging their handwriting in careful loops. Her lies were oddly specific, enough detail to be believable, but never enough to invite a deeper look. The house on Blenheim Close? Well, it stayed empty. The Edwardses couldn't sell it without raising suspicion, so they just kept up the home from a distance, making the odd visit now and then, keeping up appearances. All the while, they just kept spending. They used the stolen money to fund their obsession, buying vintage Hollywood photos, signed memorabilia, and collector's items. Gary Cooper, Frank Sinatra, Bette Davis. They filled their small flat with ghosts of a glamorous world, all paid for by the dead. But But, the debt didn't go away. As time went on, the stolen funds just weren't enough. They took out loans, borrowed money from friends, and the walls slowly began to close in. They lived in fear of being found out, always watching the mailbox, always on edge. It would take a single mistake to bring it all crashing down, and that mistake was coming. It wasn't a detective or a relative that brought the truth to light, it was a bank. In 2012, a government audit flagged suspicious activity related to William Wycherley's pension. Officials tried to contact him to verify records, but of course he wasn't there to answer. When no one could get hold of William or Patricia, police were notified. A welfare check was requested. The house at Blenheim Close appeared abandoned. Overgrown grass, curtains drawn. But what lay beneath the garden would soon shock the entire country. As investigators started digging, the cracks in the story widened. Neighbors hadn't seen the Wycherleys in over a decade. No medical records, no activity, just letters and claims from Susan. Detectives reached out to the Edwardses, who had since fled the country. Susan and Christopher had taken refuge in France, trying to escape the pressure. But guilt was catching up. Running out of money and options, they made a surprising move. They emailed the police. In a message sent to a detective, Christopher admitted there had been an incident. They agreed to return to the UK and were arrested as soon as they stepped off the train at St. Pancras Station in October 2013. Under questioning, they admitted to burying the bodies but denied murder. Susan claimed the killings were not premeditated. Investigators weren't convinced. 15 years of lies had unraveled in just a matter of weeks, and the final act of their strange, dark fantasy was about to play out in court. The trial began in 2014 at Nottingham Crown Court, and it was as surreal as the crime itself. Susan and Christopher Edwards pleaded not guilty to murder, but the jury didn't buy their version of events. The evidence was just too strong, the lies too deliberate. After a 6-week trial, both were found guilty of double murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years each. The court described their actions as, cold-blooded and calculated. What started as a shared obsession ended in 2 lives lost, and 2 more completely destroyed by the weight of a fantasy. Susan and Christopher Edwards weren't hardened criminals, they weren't violent by nature, but their obsession blinded them. What began as a love for old Hollywood spiraled into fraud, deception, and eventually cold-blooded murder. They didn't kill for hate, they killed for an illusion, for posters, autographs, and a dream that was never real. The Wycherley case is a chilling reminder of how fantasy, unchecked, can rot a person's sense of right and wrong. In the end, Susan and Christopher weren't just escaping debt, they were escaping reality. And when they took that final step, they could never go back.